The man who controlled half the city had not expected the past to stop him at a red light. Alessandro De Luca sat in the back seat of his black Maserati, one hand resting calmly against the polished wood trim, the other adjusting the signet ring that bore his family crest. The car moved smoothly through the evening traffic, flanked by vehicles that never drifted too far behind. Men watched from tinted windows. Men who answered to him without question. Chicago moved around him like a machine he had mastered years ago. At 40, Alessandro was everything his world demanded. Measured, feared, untouchable. He had learned early that emotions were liabilities and attachments were weaknesses enemies waited patiently to exploit. He had built his empire on restraint, silence, and decisions that left no room for regret. The light ahead turned red. The car slowed. Pedestrians stepped into the crosswalk, their lives small and ordinary, their worries insignificant compared to the calculations constantly running through Alessandro's mind. He watched them without interest, already thinking ahead to meetings, territory, names that would soon be erased. Then he saw her. She was crossing from left to right, her steps cautious, deliberate. One hand gripped a small child's fingers, the other held a worn handbag close to her side as if it contained everything she owned. Her dark hair was pulled back carelessly, strands loose around a face marked by exhaustion rather than age. Even after years of absence, even after convincing himself she no longer existed, Alessandro recognized her instantly. Amelia Rossi, the woman he had walked away from without explanation. The woman he had loved before he chose power over truth. The child beside her looked no older than 6. Waited, quiet, watching the world with a seriousness that did not belong to someone so young. As they reached the center of the road, Amelia instinctively shifted her body, placing herself between the child and the waiting cars. The gesture hit Alessandro harder than any gunshot ever had. His breath stalled. The resemblance was subtle but undeniable. The shape of the jaw, the dark eyes that observed without fear. The timing struck him all at once, cold and precise. Too precise to ignore. For the first time in decades, Alessandro De Luca did not know what to do. The city noise faded. The hum of engines blurred. The child looked up at Amelia and said something Alessandro could not hear. She answered softly, her hand tightening around the small fingers in hers. Then they reached the other side of the street. Amelia never looked back. The light turned green. The driver waited. Behind Alessandro, his men shifted, uncertain. He had not moved. He had not spoken. A man who ruled through decisiveness sat frozen as the past disappeared into the crowd. Alessandro finally leaned back against the leather seat. His expression returning to stone, but something inside him had cracked. The life he believed he had buried had not stayed buried. It had been waiting. Alessandro De Luca had learned long ago that power thrived on distance. From the outside, his life looked immovable, an estate of stone and iron rising above the city, guards positioned like statues at every gate, halls that echoed with quiet authority. Men spoke softly around him. Decisions made in his presence carried weight far beyond the room. A single nod from Alessandro could shift alliances, end disputes, erase problems that had names only moments before. Yet every night, when the doors closed and the city fell silent beneath his windows, the same truth waited for him. He was alone by design. Alessandro stood in his study, hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the lights below. He did this often. It reminded him that the world was ordered, that everything had its place if one was strong enough to enforce it. Emotion disrupted that order. Attachment complicated it. Love destroyed it. That was the rule he lived by. His father had taught him early. Never love what can be taken from you. Alessandro had watched men crumble when wives were threatened, when children were used as leverage. He had watched empires fall because someone mistook affection for strength. When his turn came to lead, he promised himself he would never make the same mistake. Walking away from Amelia had been the hardest decision of his life, and the most necessary. At least that was what he told himself. Years ago, she had stood in a small apartment kitchen, her hands trembling as she asked him why he had grown distant. He remembered the look in her eyes when he told her she didn't belong in his world. He remembered how carefully he chose his words, how cold he forced his voice to be, how he turned his back before she could see the hesitation he refused to explain. He had left without looking back. Not because he didn't love her, 'cause he loved her too much. Since then, Alessandro had ruled without mercy but also without joy. His days were structured. Meetings, negotiations, discipline enforced with quiet efficiency. His nights were empty, filled with the echo of choices he never allowed himself to question. Women came and went, beautiful and forgettable, never close enough to matter. No one stayed. That was the cost of safety. Yet now, the image of Amelia crossing the road refused to leave him. The way she had instinctively shielded the child. The exhaustion she carried without complaint. The small hand wrapped trustingly around hers. Alessandro replayed the moment again and again, searching for logic where emotion had no place. He poured himself a drink and didn't touch it. The child's face lingered in his mind, not as proof, not yet, but as possibility. And possibility was dangerous. Possibility demanded answers. Answers led to choices. And choices had consequences he had spent years avoiding. Alessandro did not believe in coincidences. If the child was his, then everything he had built rested on a lie. He moved through the house with measured steps, passing rooms filled with expensive art and furniture chosen for status rather than comfort. Nothing here bore fingerprints of real living. No laughter. No small shoes by the door. No reminders that life existed beyond control. This was the world he had chosen. And yet, for the first time in years, it felt incomplete. At dawn, Alessandro summoned Marco, his most trusted lieutenant. Marco had followed him since his rise, had seen him at his most ruthless and his most restrained. If anyone noticed the shift in Alessandro's silence, he did not say it aloud. "I want information," Alessandro said calmly. "Amelia Rossi, her address, her work, her routine." Marco's eyes flickered just briefly. "And the child?" Alessandro's jaw tightened. "Everything." There were no further questions. As Marco left, Alessandro returned to the window. The city was waking now. Traffic building, people beginning ordinary lives that never intersected with his. Somewhere among them, Amelia was moving through her day, unaware that the man who once vanished from her life was watching again. He told himself this was precaution, responsibility, control. But beneath the discipline and the rules he had lived by for years, another truth pressed forward, impossible to silence. Walking away had not protected Amelia. It had only ensured she would face the hardest years of her life without him. And for the first time since he became Alessandro De Luca, Mafia Boss, ruler of shadows, the question that haunted him was not how to maintain power, but whether power was worth anything if it had cost him the one life he could never replace. Amelia Rossi hated crosswalks. They forced her to stop, to stand still in the open, to wait while the world rushed past without noticing her. She preferred motion, one step after another, head down, mind focused on what came next. Stopping gave memories time to surface, and memories were a luxury she could no longer afford. The light changed, and she stepped off the curb. The city was loud that evening. Horns blared, engines idled impatiently, people brushed past with phones pressed to their ears. Amelia tightened her grip on the small hand in hers, feeling the warmth of it steady her. Matteo walked beside her quietly, his short legs working hard to keep pace. His eyes fixed on the painted lines beneath their feet as if they were something important. "Almost there," she murmured, more to herself than to him. She did not look up at the traffic. She never did. Looking invited fear, and fear slowed you down. Halfway across the road, Matteo stumbled slightly. Amelia reacted instantly, shifting her body, placing herself between him and the nearest car without thinking. She crouched just enough to steady him, her free hand brushing his shoulder. "Careful," she said softly. "I'm okay," he answered, serious beyond his years. She smiled despite herself and urged him forward again. What Amelia did not see was the black Maserati stopped at the light. She did not see the man inside it go completely still. She did not feel the weight of eyes on her back, heavy with recognition and disbelief. She reached the center of the crosswalk and, for a brief moment, something made her hesitate. It was not a sound, not a voice, just a sensation, an awareness she had not felt in years, like a shadow stretching across her path. Amelia lifted her gaze, scanning the line of cars waiting for the light to change. And then she saw him. The world did not shatter. Narrowed. Alessandro De Luca sat in the back seat, his face partially shadowed, his posture unchanged from the man she remembered. He looked exactly as he always had, controlled, distant, untouchable. The years had sharpened him rather than softened him. Power still clung to him like a second skin. For a single heartbeat, neither of them moved. Amelia's breath caught painfully in her chest. Her first instinct was denial. Her second was anger. Her third, strongest of all, was protection. She tightened her grip on Matteo's hand and turned her body slightly, blocking Alessandro's view of the child without even realizing she was doing it. The gesture was instinct, not strategy. Matteo leaned closer to her, sensing the shift in her without understanding it. "Mom," he asked quietly. "We're fine," she said, forcing calm into her voice. She did not allow herself to look at Alessandro again. Looking would mean acknowledging him. Acknowledging him meant opening a door she had nailed shut years ago with pain and resolve. The light changed. Amelia walked. She did not run. She did not falter. She crossed the remaining distance with steady steps, her spine straight, her expression unreadable. The sidewalk welcomed her with familiar indifference. The city swallowed her whole once more. Behind her, traffic resumed. Alessandro watched her disappear into the crowd, his chest tight, his thoughts loud for the first time in years. He had not imagined her. He had not imagined the child. The resemblance was there, not enough to be proof, but enough to be dangerous. "Boss," the driver said cautiously. Alessandro did not answer right away. His gaze remained fixed on the spot where Amelia had vanished, as if she might reappear if he waited long enough. "Drive," he said finally. The car moved, but something essential had been left behind at that crosswalk. Amelia did not stop walking until she turned the corner. Only then did she allow herself to breathe properly. Her heart hammered against her ribs, anger and fear tangling in her chest like wire. Of all the streets in the city, of all the nights, she crouched in front of Matteo, her hands resting on his shoulders, forcing a smile she had perfected over the years. "You did great," she said. "Thank you for holding my hand." He nodded, solemn. The man in the car was staring. Amelia's smile tightened. "Sometimes people stare," she said. "It doesn't mean anything." But she knew better. As they continued on toward home, Amelia's mind raced. Not with longing, not with hope, but with a single sharp thought she had lived by since the night Alessandro walked away. He had chosen his world. She had chosen survival. And whatever ghosts had resurfaced at that crosswalk, she would not let them touch her child. The city moved, but Alessandro did not. The Maserati carried him forward through streets he had ruled for years, yet his mind remained stranded at the crosswalk, fixed on the shape of a woman walking away and a child whose face refused to fade. He had trained himself never to react in public, never to allow hesitation to show. Tonight that discipline felt brittle. He returned to his estate without speaking. The gates opened. Guards nodded. The house welcomed him with its familiar silence, cool and immaculate. Alessandro removed his jacket and draped it over a chair, then stood in the center of the room as if waiting for an instruction that never came. He replayed the moment again, slower this time. The way Amelia had stiffened the instant she saw him. The subtle turn of her body, shielding the child without thought. Not fear for herself, instinct for someone else. The child's hand fit too naturally in hers. Their steps matched in a rhythm learned through repetition. This was not a borrowed responsibility. This was habit. This was life. Alessandro poured a drink and finally took a sip. It burned, grounding him. He did not ask the question aloud. He could not. Asking would mean crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. It would mean admitting the possibility that everything he had done in the name of protection had failed in the most fundamental way. That he had not removed Amelia from danger. He had removed himself from responsibility. He moved into his study and closed the door. The walls were lined with books he rarely read, records of deals made and debts settled. Proof of a life built on certainty. He sat at his desk and stared at the polished surface, seeing instead the child's eyes. Dark, observant, unafraid. Too familiar. He told himself resemblance meant nothing. Children borrowed features from the world around them. Coincidence existed. He had survived this long by trusting logic over instinct. And yet, instinct had never been wrong before. Alessandro picked up his phone, then set it down again. There was no call he could make that would not change everything. No message that would not echo back with consequences he could not control. He imagined confronting Amelia. Her guarded expression, the wall she would raise in an instant. He imagined her denial, or worse, her silence. Silence had always been her strength. The clock on the wall ticked, each second pressing in on him. Outside, the city pulsed with life. Somewhere within it, Amelia was putting a child to bed, brushing hair from a small forehead, whispering reassurance he would never hear. The thought tightened something in his chest. Alessandro stood and walked to the window. From this height, the city looked orderly, lights arranged like a map he could read. But beneath that order was chaos he could not command. Lives unfolding beyond his reach. He had once believed walking away was the final word. That absence could be clean. That time would dull what memory could not erase. He had been wrong. The question hovered at the edge of his mind, sharp and relentless. Is he mine? He did not ask it. Instead, Alessandro made a different choice, the kind he had always been good at. He would observe. He would gather information. He would remain unseen. Power, after all, was knowing without being known. He summoned Marco just before midnight. Quietly, Alessandro said when his lieutenant arrived. No contact. No disturbances. Marco listened without interruption. His expression neutral. And if she notices? She won't, Alessandro replied. Make sure of it. There was a pause, brief but deliberate. The child? Marco asked. Alessandro's jaw tightened. Especially the child. When Marco left, Alessandro remained where he was, hands resting on the edge of the desk. He had avoided the question by turning it into an operation, but the truth lingered, unspoken and heavy. For the first time in years, Alessandro De Luca found himself afraid, not of enemies, not of loss of power, but of an answer he already suspected. Some questions, once asked, demanded a life in return. And Alessandro was not yet ready to pay that price. Amelia Rossi's life ran on necessity. Morning began before the sun rose, when the apartment was still wrapped in silence, and the city outside had not yet started asking anything of her. She moved quietly, careful not to wake Matteo too early, stepping around the small space with practiced efficiency. The apartment was modest. Second-hand furniture, pale walls marked by time, a single window that let in just enough light to remind her the world was still there. She brewed coffee she rarely finished and packed a simple lunch she might not eat. Some days, survival meant choosing which needs could wait. Matteo emerged from the bedroom rubbing his eyes, hair sticking up in uneven tufts. Amelia crouched to straighten his jacket, smoothing it with gentle hands that had learned to be firm and tender at the same time. She kissed his forehead, lingering just a second longer than usual, breathing him in as if that alone could fortify her for the day. They walked everywhere. Buses cost money. Taxis were a luxury Amelia had forgotten how to imagine. She held Matteo's hand as they navigated cracked sidewalks and impatient crowds, her eyes always scanning, always calculating. Safety had become instinct, not fear. Fear wasted energy she could not spare. At the daycare, she knelt to meet Mateo's eyes. "I'll be back before you know it," she said, smiling with a confidence she manufactured daily. "Promise?" he asked. "Always." Promises were the one currency she never failed to honor. Work was long and unglamorous. Amelia cleaned offices at night and worked a small cafe during the day. Her body constantly in motion, her mind never resting. She memorized schedules, cut corners where she could, stretched every dollar until it thinned into something barely visible. She learned which bills could wait and which could not. She learned to sleep in fragments. She never complained. Complaints did not feed a child. Complaints did not keep the lights on. Complaints did not matter. What mattered was endurance. There were moments, rare, unguarded, when exhaustion crept too close. When her hands shook as she folded laundry late at night. When silence pressed against her chest so heavily she had to remind herself to breathe. In those moments, memories threatened to surface. Alessandro's voice, his absence, the night he walked away. She did not allow herself to linger there. Thinking about what might have been was a luxury she could not afford. The past had already taken enough from her. She would not let it steal the present too. Mateo was her anchor. His questions, his quiet observations, the way he noticed everything. He had learned early not to ask for more than she could give. That knowledge hurt more than hunger ever had. Amelia compensated the only way she knew how. Attention, presence, love poured freely even when everything else was scarce. At night, when Mateo slept, Amelia sat beside his bed and watched his chest rise and fall. She traced the curve of his face with her eyes, memorizing him as if he might vanish if she didn't. She wondered sometimes if he would ever ask about his father. The question hovered at the edges of her thoughts, unanswered and unwelcome. She had made that decision alone. When she discovered she was pregnant years ago, fear had nearly broken her. Not fear of motherhood but fear of hope. She had considered reaching out, had stood outside a building she could not enter, staring at doors that never opened. Each refusal hardened something inside her until resolve replaced longing. She chose silence because silence was safer than rejection. Raising Mateo alone had been brutal, but it had also forged her. Amelia had learned she was capable of more than she had ever believed. She learned that strength did not announce itself. It showed up every day, quietly, relentlessly, without applause. Love, she realized, was not protection from pain. It was the reason you endured it. When she lay down at night, exhaustion heavy in her bones, Amelia allowed herself one indulgence, imagining a future where Mateo would never feel the weight she carried, where his life would be lighter, where the world would meet him with kindness instead of demand. She did not need power. She did not need rescue. She needed time. And as she slept, unaware of eyes watching from afar, Amelia Rossi continued doing what she had done for years, building a life from fragments, holding it together with quiet strength, and surviving not because it was easy, but because someone depended on her to. Alessandro did not sleep. The night stretched thin and restless, broken only by the quiet arrival of information. Files appeared on his desk before dawn, neatly organized, precise, merciless. Marco worked efficiently as he always had, delivering facts without commentary, as if facts alone could not undo a man. Alessandro read in silence. Amelia Rossi, current address, employment records, financial history that spoke more loudly than any confession ever could. Numbers that told a story of endurance and restraint, of a life balanced carefully on the edge of collapse and held there by sheer will. Then he reached the page marked dependent. Matteo Rossi, 6 years old. Alessandro's hand stilled. He read the birth date once. Then again. The calculation formed instantly, cold and exact. Too exact. He leaned back in his chair, staring at nothing as memory supplied what paper did not. The last night he saw Amelia, the words he had used like a blade, the door closing between them. The timing aligned with brutal precision. He turned the page. Medical summaries followed. Routine pediatric visits. No father listed. Emergency contact. Amelia Rossi. Only Amelia. Always Amelia. There were notes from a clinic visit 2 years prior, a comment made by a physician in passing, strong resemblance to paternal line. Alessandro's jaw tightened. Resemblance. The word echoed unpleasantly. He thought of Matteo's eyes at the crosswalk, dark and steady. Too steady. The same way Alessandro's had been described when he was a child. He flipped another page. A photograph slipped free from the file and landed face up on the desk. It was recent, taken from a distance. Amelia stood outside the daycare, her hand resting lightly on Matteo's shoulder. The boy was mid-sentence, his mouth curved in concentration, his brow faintly furrowed in a way Alessandro knew intimately. The tilt of the head, the line of the jaw, even the way he stood, feet planted, spine straight, as if the world required readiness. Blood did not forget. Alessandro closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. He had spent a lifetime denying instinct in favor of control, but instinct was screaming now, loud and unrelenting. This was not coincidence. This was consequence. He reached for another document. Birth records. The hospital name struck him first. A public facility. No private room. No special treatment. He imagined Amelia there, alone, navigating pain without comfort, fear without reassurance. His fingers curled against the edge of the desk. There it was. Under father. Not listed. Alessandro exhaled slowly. The absence felt like accusation. Marco stood quietly near the door. "There's more," he said at last. Alessandro did not look up. "Speak." "The boy's blood type," Marco continued. "Rare. Matches yours." Silence followed. Heavy. Alessandro's hand closed around the edge of the file. He did not need DNA tests or confirmations whispered behind closed doors. The evidence had assembled itself piece by piece, undeniable in its simplicity. He had a son. The realization did not arrive with triumph or relief. It arrived like weight. Sudden, crushing, irreversible. A truth that redefined everything behind it. Alessandro stood and moved to the window, the city still gray with early morning light. Somewhere down there Matteo was waking up, eating breakfast, tying shoes too big for his feet. Living a life that had unfolded without Alessandro's presence, without his protection, without his name. A life built in spite of him. He had told himself walking away was an act of mercy. That distance would keep Amelia safe. That absence was preferable to danger. The truth, laid bare on paper, was far more unforgiving. He had not spared her suffering. He had transferred it entirely onto her shoulders. "Has anyone else seen this?" Alessandro asked quietly. "No," Marco replied. "And no one will." "Good." Alessandro turned back to the desk and picked up the photograph again. His thumb hovered near the boy's face but did not touch it. He was not entitled to that intimacy. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. A knock sounded faintly somewhere in the house. Life continuing. The world indifferent to revelations that changed everything. Alessandro De Luca, who had commanded men without hesitation, now faced a truth that stripped him of certainty. Blood had reached across years of silence and claimed him without permission. He straightened, resolve settling into place with familiar clarity. "Double the protection," he said. "No mistakes. No exposure." Marco nodded. As the door closed behind his lieutenant, Alessandro remained alone with the file, the photograph, and a future that had just narrowed to a single, undeniable point. He had walked away once. This time blood would not allow it. Alessandro moved with purpose the moment the decision settled in him. By mid-morning, the house was awake in the way it always was. Quiet, efficient, obedient. Men took positions without instruction. Phones rang once and stopped. Orders passed without names attached to them. This was how protection began in Alessandro De Luca's world. Unseen, unquestioned, absolute. He stood at the long table in his study, the file closed now but far from dismissed. Knowing the truth did not grant him the right to act openly. Power demanded patience. Emotion demanded restraint. He summoned the men he trusted most. They arrived one by one, expressions neutral, eyes sharp. Alessandro did not waste words. "She is not to know," he said. "Neither is the child." No one asked why. "Two teams," Alessandro continued. "One visible only to us. One invisible to everyone. I want eyes on her routes, her work, the child's school. I want patterns, not interference. If danger appears, it disappears before it reaches her. And if she notices?" one of the men asked. "She won't," Alessandro said calmly. "If she does, you've failed." Silence followed, heavy with understanding. Alessandro had spent his life building systems designed to protect assets, territory, reputation, leverage. He applied the same precision now, but this time the asset breathed. This time, it slept and woke and held a woman's hand at crosswalks. The men dispersed. The machinery turned. By nightfall, the city around Amelia Rossi subtly shifted. A man lingered at the corner cafe a little longer than usual. A parked car remained where it had not before. A figure crossed the street at a distance, always moving, never staring. Protection without permission. Amelia felt none of it. Her day unfolded as it always did. Work, errands, the careful choreography of time and energy. She sensed the world pressing in as she always had, but nothing unusual pierced her awareness. Matteo laughed at something she said on the walk home, swinging their joined hands as if the world were light. Alessandro watched through reports, through images taken from angles that respected distance. He studied them in silence, memorizing details he had no right to know. The way Amelia's shoulders relaxed when Matteo smiled, the way she listened more than she spoke, the way the child leaned toward her without hesitation. He felt a pull he had never allowed himself before. This was not ownership. This was responsibility. At night, Alessandro returned to the window overlooking the city. He no longer saw it as territory alone. Somewhere within its sprawl, a woman and a child moved through their lives under his shadow, unaware of how close it had come to touching them. He told himself this was temporary, necessary, that once he was certain they were safe, he would step back. But even as the thought formed, he knew it was a lie. Power had always come easily to him. Control had been his language. But this watching from afar, this restraint, this was a different kind of discipline. One that demanded he act without recognition, without gratitude, without presence. It demanded sacrifice. Alessandro checked his phone once, then set it aside. There were calls he could make, truths he could speak, but speaking them would fracture the fragile balance he had imposed. Amelia had built a life without him. He would not disrupt it to satisfy his own need for absolution. Not yet. The first rule of protection was patience. And so Alessandro De Luca did what he had always done best. He waited, he watched, and he ensured that anyone who dared look too closely at Amelia Rossi or her son would never realize how close they had come to crossing a line. A name surfaced in a report where it did not belong. A familiar one. Careless, ambitious, and far too curious. Alessandro noticed it immediately. He had trained himself to notice shifts in patterns, the slightest misalignment in the machinery he controlled. Someone was watching the watchers. He did not react. Reaction was confirmation. Instead, he read the report again, slower this time. A rival crew had increased its presence on the south side. Not aggressively, casually, too casually. Men asking questions they had no business asking. Cars idling a little too long near streets that held no strategic value. No territory dispute justified it. Only interest did. Alessandro closed the file and leaned back in his chair. For years, his enemies had complained that he was impossible to read. No vices, no family, no emotional leverage. That reputation had protected him as effectively as any weapon. Now something had changed. He summoned Marco. "They're circling," Alessandro said calmly. "Testing." Marco nodded once. They've noticed the movement. Of course they have, Alessandro replied. They always do. What's the play? Marco asked. Alessandro was silent for a moment. This was the moment enemies waited for. The hesitation, the instinct to overcorrect. He would give them neither. We don't pull back, he said. That would confirm suspicion. We don't escalate either. That would signal fear. And Amelia? Marco asked carefully. Alessandro's expression hardened. She remains untouched. Invisible. The truth was simple and brutal. The more Alessandro protected her, the more dangerous she became. Not because of who she was, but because of what she represented. Proof that Alessandro De Luca was not as untouchable as legend claimed. Across the city, men with long memories began whispering. They remembered the woman Alessandro once favored. They remembered how abruptly she vanished. They remembered threats made years ago, dismissed then as rumor. Rumors had teeth now. A message arrived that night, delivered through a channel meant for warnings disguised as pleasantries. A dinner invitation. Neutral ground. Polite language. Old enemies pretending to be curious friends. Alessandro declined. The next message was less subtle. Everyone has something to lose, it read. Alessandro stared at the screen, then set the phone down. He had lost many things in his life. Fear was not one of them. He ordered adjustments, subtle ones. Routes changed. Schedules tightened. Surveillance widened its circle without drawing closer. He would not allow panic to expose what discipline could conceal. But discipline could not silence instinct. He found himself checking reports more frequently, asking questions he had never needed to ask before. Not about numbers or weapons, but about proximity, timing, risk. Attachment altered perception. That was its danger. Amelia sensed none of it. Her days continued in their familiar rhythm. But one evening, as she locked the apartment door behind her, she felt something she could not name. A prickle at the back of her neck, a sense of being observed. She dismissed it. She had lived too long on alert to trust every shadow. Alessandro, however, trusted patterns. And the pattern forming was unmistakable. His rivals were patient. They were not searching for Amelia yet. Not openly. They were searching for confirmation, watching Alessandro instead. Waiting for him to make a mistake. He would not. But the margin for error was narrowing. Late that night, Alessandro stood alone in his study, city lights flickering below. He had built his empire on the principle that weakness must never be visible. Now he understood the cruel irony of his situation. He had not become weaker. He had become exposed. An exposure in his world invited blood. For the first time, Alessandro considered a possibility he had avoided since the crosswalk, the idea that silence alone would no longer be enough. That protection from the shadows might fail if enemies decided to drag the truth into the light. He did not regret knowing about the child. He regretted how much knowing had changed him. Somewhere in the city, rivals were smiling, convinced they had finally found the crack in Alessandro De Luca's armor. They did not yet understand the mistake they were making. Weakness did not make Alessandro reckless, made him dangerous. Alessandro made the decision before dawn. It was not dramatic. There was no surge of emotion, no moment of hesitation followed by resolve. The choice arrived the way all real ones did, quietly, inevitably, after every other option had exhausted itself. Staying hidden was no longer protection. It was delay. He dressed without assistance, choosing a dark coat instead of a suit, the kind he wore when he wanted to be seen as a man rather than a symbol. The house remained silent as he left, his guards falling in behind him out of habit. He waved them back after the gates closed. "This part," he said evenly, "I do alone." They did not argue. The city was pale with early light when Alessandro drove himself across streets he usually viewed from the safety of tinted glass. He parked several blocks away from Amelia's neighborhood and walked the rest of the distance, hands in his coat pockets, posture unremarkable by design. This was not a confrontation. It was not an attempt to reclaim anything. It was acknowledgement. Amelia was leaving the apartment building when he saw her. She balanced a bag on one shoulder, keys in hand, already thinking ahead. Matteo followed close beside her, backpack bouncing lightly against his back. Alessandro stopped. For a moment he simply watched. Not as a strategist, not as a boss, but as a man witnessing a life that existed without him. Matteo laughed at something she said. Amelia smiled. Not the polite smile she offered the world, but the unguarded one she reserved for her child. The sound landed somewhere deep in Alessandro's chest, unfamiliar and painful. He stepped forward before he could reconsider. Amelia! She froze. Slowly she turned. Recognition passed over her face like a shadow. Not surprise. She had felt the world shifting since the crosswalk. Not fear either. Just a tightening, a closing of doors. Alessandro, she said evenly. Matteo looked between them, curious. Who's that? Amelia's hand found his shoulder, instinctive and firm. Someone from my past. Alessandro crouched slightly, lowering himself to the child's level without thinking. Matteo studied him openly, eyes sharp and unafraid. You're very early, Matteo observed. A corner of Alessandro's mouth lifted despite himself. So I've been told. Amelia's gaze never left him. Why are you here? Alessandro straightened. The street felt suddenly exposed, every sound too loud, every movement too visible. Still he did not retreat. Because hiding is no longer enough, he said quietly. And because I won't pretend I didn't see you. Silence stretched between them. Amelia exhaled slowly. You should leave. I will, Alessandro replied. After this. He met her eyes, holding them without challenge, without demand. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect answers. I only need you to know one thing. She waited. I won't disappear again. The words were simple. Their weight was not. Amelia studied him as if searching for the lie she had learned to expect years ago. Matteo shifted, sensing the tension. Mom, he said softly. Are we late? No, she replied, eyes still on Alessandro. We're not late. She looked back at Alessandro then, something sharp and guarded in her expression. This doesn't change anything, she said. I know, he answered. But if you bring danger into my child's life. I won't, Alessandro said immediately. That's the point. She hesitated, then nodded once. Not acceptance. Not trust. Permission to leave without escalation. Amelia turned and guided Matteo down the street. Neither of them looked back. Alessandro remained where he was long after they disappeared. His heart pounding harder than it ever had in battle. He had not claimed anything. He had not demanded truth. He had simply stepped into the light and let himself be seen. It was the first choice he had ever made as a father. And it had changed everything. Alessandro returned to his estate as the city slipped into night, but it no longer felt like a fortress. The walls were the same, the guards unchanged, yet something essential had shifted. Power had always meant distance, layers of silence between himself and consequence. Now distance felt like cowardice dressed as discipline. He dismissed the men waiting in the hall and went straight to his study. The desk was already arranged. Reports stacked, calls logged, a familiar rhythm ready to swallow him whole. He did not sit. Instead, he stood at the window and watched the city breathe. For years, his empire had been a perfect machine. Territories balanced, rivals contained, violence calculated and precise. Everything existed to preserve a name that inspired fear without needing explanation. Alessandro De Luca had never questioned whether it was worth it. Power justified itself. Until a child asked who he was. Legacy had always been an abstract thing. Assets, influence, stories told by men who survived him. Tonight it had a face. Small hands. A future that could be broken by a single careless decision. He turned from the window and reached for the phone. Marco, he said when the line connected. I want a meeting. All heads. Tonight. There was a pause. That will raise questions. Good, Alessandro replied. I'm done answering them in silence. The room filled an hour later. Familiar faces took their seats, eyes alert, senses tuned for danger. They expected orders that tightened control, strategies that crushed opposition. What they received instead was something unfamiliar. I'm restructuring, Alessandro said evenly. Effective immediately. Murmurs rippled. He raised a hand and they died. Certain routes are closed. Certain operations end tonight. We consolidate and pull back from exposure that invites unnecessary blood. One man leaned forward. We'll lose ground. We'll lose risk, Alessandro corrected. And gain time. Another spoke cautious. Our rivals will read this as weakness. Alessandro met his gaze without blinking. Let them. Silence followed. This was not the Alessandro they knew, the man who expanded without apology, who answered pressure with force. But no one challenged him. They had learned long ago that when Alessandro spoke like this, the decision was already final. I built this empire to survive, he continued, not to consume everything around it. Anyone who can't adapt is free to leave. No one stood. The meeting ended without ceremony. Orders would ripple outward, changing patterns enemies had memorized for years. Alessandro knew there would be consequences. There always were. But consequences could be managed. Regret was the only thing he could not afford anymore. Later, alone again. He poured a drink and finally allowed himself to sit. He thought of Amelia's eyes when he said he wouldn't disappear. Not hopeful. Not trusting. Measuring. Fair. Trust was earned. Not demanded. Not bought. He understood now that legacy was not built by fear alone. Fear ended with death. Legacy endured because someone chose to carry it forward. Alessandro picked up a pen and signed his name on a document he had avoided for years. Directives that transferred authority, redistributed power, ensured continuity beyond him. He did not weaken the empire. He gave it a future that did not require his constant presence. For the first time, he imagined a life where his name did not have to mean danger to those he loved. Outside, the city lights blurred softly. Somewhere within them, Amelia was tucking Matteo into bed, unaware of the decisions being made in his name. Alessandro did not need her gratitude. He needed her safety. Power, he realized, was not the ability to take. It was the discipline to choose what you would never take again. He set the pen down and stood, feeling the weight lift. Not disappear, but shift into something bearable. Alessandro De Luca had ruled an empire. Now he chose to build a legacy. And for the first time, the future did not terrify him.